Hi, welcome back to our baby boomer walk around Chelsea. We're back on Cheney Walk, only 5 minutes away from where I left you on Old Church Street. The what three words are tables, digit, sheets. It's given us the opportunity to cross over and walk along the riverside. We've passed Battersea Bridge and have come to some houseboats. But before we start, I'll give you a feel of what we have to look forward to on the remainder of this walk. We'll see where it all started for the Stones, the Sex Pistols and the Sgt. Pepper album cover. Oh, and even Winnie the Pooh, along with so much more, including a closer look at the King's Road and some of the premises that were at the centre of pop culture in the 20th century. Houseboats on this section of the Thames have been a feature since the Second World War, when redundant military vessels were converted into living accommodation. It was a relatively cheap form of housing, but like the rest of Chelsea, in recent years it's been subject to gentrification. The cost of being moored here has gone up considerably, and a lot of the long-term tenants have moved on. The English actress Dorothy Tooting lived here in the 50s, and such famous names at the time as Vivian Leigh, Richard Burton and Laurence Olivier have been known to visit. In the early 80s, at the height of his career with Motorhead, heavy metal singer and songwriter Lemmy lived on a houseboat which was painted pink. We stopped here primarily to look at houses across the road. Number 96 was one of Whistler's Chelsea homes. It's not that he owned a lot of houses, he just moved around a bit. Its significance is that it's where he painted the portrait of his mother. In more recent times, it was owned by Russian oligarch Roman Abramovich. Number 98 is another house with a blue plaque on the wall, and I feel it'd be wrong for me not to mention the recipients of this particular blue plaque. Mark Brunel's engineering career had been successful enough in 1807 to buy this impressive property, but his son Isambard, who grew up here with his parents, went on to eclipse his father's. He was a civil engineer at the heart of Britain's industrial revolution, embracing new technology and materials to change the way we travel forever. Much of his infrastructure is still in daily use 150 years later. Evidence of his work is probably most visible in Bristol, where he designed the Temple Meads railway station, the Clifton suspension bridge and the transatlantic steamer the SS Great Britain, which is open to the public. Road, rail and sea, in a nutshell, is Isambard Kingdom Brunel's legacy, which all started in this house. However, we're here for a resident who moved in over 170 years after the Brunels moved out. Mick Jagger moved in 2001 with his partner Lorenz Scott. Mick owned properties all around the world. This was his London base. Loren was an American fashion designer whose clothes were worn by such people as Michelle Obama and Nicole Kidman. They remained a couple until her death in 2014. She hung herself in her New York apartment. Mick sung at her funeral, and in case you're wondering which Stone song would be appropriate, he sang Bob Dylan's Just Like a Woman. A few doors down, there's a very different house, number 103. It was bought by Ronnie Wood, bandmate of Mick Jagger. There's no evidence he ever lived here. He bought it as an investment in 2006 with his son Tyrone. They spent the next 2 years refurbishing it and sold it for about 1.5 million less than he paid for it, which I'd imagine is quite difficult to do around here. Continuing a little along Cheney Walk, we come to a pair of properties that are set back a little and appear to be quite unremarkable. Even the commemorative plaque is quite discreet, but sometimes appearances can be deceptive. 118 and 119 are actually one property, with 8 bedrooms and 5 bathrooms, and has been since the late 19th century. The property has had many significant owners over the centuries, and we're going to take a look at just 3 of them. The commemorative stone in the wall is for J.M.W. Turner. Another historical figure, and as you know, I'm concentrating on people from the late 20th century on this walk, but there are some people who have been so important to the country's history, I think they deserve a mention. They're not there as fillers, because believe me, the high concentration of famous or influential people that have lived in this area is so high, I'm having to be selective about who I talk about. So, Joseph Mallord William Turner, or Billy to his friends, as I'm sure you know, is one of England's most famous and respected artists. Even a Philistine like me can recognise a Turner landscape when I see one. And if you want to see one up close, then you have plenty of opportunity, because Turner bequeathed over 550 oil paintings and 2,000 watercolours to a nation. The largest collection are on display in the Tate Britain on Millbank, which is about a 2-mile walk back along the Chelsea embankment towards Westminster. He died here and was buried in St Paul's Cathedral. Interestingly, his contemporary and rival John Constable, who died 14 years before Turner, has a lower profile resting place in St John at Hampstead graveyard. I'm not sure why Turner was given the privilege of being interred in St Paul's, while Constable wasn't. Maybe the fact that Turner bequeathed his art to the nation. A JMW Turner painting has changed hands for £30 million. If you want to learn more about John Constable, then check out my YouTube video, A Short Walk Around Hampstead Village. In more recent times, it's been owned by 2 famous rockers, one of them being that man Ronnie Wood again. I really don't know the circumstances of why he purchased it or whether it is his main London home, because Ronnie has owned many houses in and around London. But what I do know is he's a keen artist and a big admirer of Turner. The other rocker is Canadian singer Bryan Adams. Whereas Ronnie Wood seems to have dipped in and out of property ownership in Chelsea, Bryan Adams has been a long-term resident. He bought 118 to 119 in the 1990s. It's rumoured that Princess Diana would privately visit after her divorce from King Charles in 1996. Over the years, he's bought up many of the properties around his house, most famously number 114, which we've just walked past, but we can just about see it from here. It looks a fairly insignificant building now, but for me, and to be fair, partly my imagination, number 114, or the King's Arms as it used to be, is very significant in popular music, and specifically rock music. There's been a pub called the King's Arms since Turner's day. This photo, I suspect, was taken in the early 1960s, and the top floors are very recognisable. Bryan Adams bought the pub in 1995 and closed it. The story goes that he didn't like the noise from the customers. Now, before you rush off to burn your copy of Everything I Do It For You and cancel him on social media, I will expand a bit more. It's never been confirmed this was his motivation. Admittedly, the pub had been raided for drugs 2 years earlier and cocaine and cannabis were seized. However, as I mentioned earlier, he has purchased up to 6 properties in this block. Some he's converted into a photographic studio and gallery, and one property on the street at the back in Apollo Place is the home of the Bryan Adams Foundation, which is a charitable organisation set up about 20 years ago. They support good causes abroad and locally. So maybe there's more to this story than meets the eye. However, in my opinion, as this was possibly the last riverside pub between here and Westminster, in that respect alone, it's a loss to the area. But when you realise that within sight of this pub, Mick Jagger, Bryan Adams and Lemmy all lived, and in Apollo Place only metres away, Simon Le Bon had a property in the 80s, and Joe Strummer at The Clash shared a flat with his girlfriend just around the corner, that is some list of pop and rock frontmen. Now this is where I let my imagination run away with me. Just picture an evening when Mick, Brian, Lemmy, Simon and Joe all independently decide to pop down to the King's Arms for a pint and find out it's karaoke night. Wow, that would have been some night. Now, I realise that probably never happened, and there's no evidence that any of them ever drunk in here, with the exception of Lemmy, who would regularly spend hours on the fruit machine. But I don't think it's unreasonable to think that they probably all crossed the threshold at some time. Right, time to move on. On our left, we pass some more houseboats, one of which was owned by artist Damien Hirst until recently, who was a Turner Prize winner. It's a small world. On your right, you can't fail to see the 7 high-rise blocks that are part of the World's End estate. It was on this estate that Joe Strummer was living when the Clash recorded their classic album London Calling, which sold over 5 million copies. Now, while Bob Marley's Exodus album maybe wasn't inspired by his time spent in London, clearly London Calling, with its references to social issues of the day, is heavily influenced by Joe's experiences and, by implication, his time living on the World's End estate. You may or may not be totally familiar with the lyrics of the song London Calling, but you will know the line, "And I live by the river." Yeah, sorry about that. Well, now you know, he did indeed live by the river. Joe didn't live in one of the high-rise blocks. He was in one of the flats on the corner of Edith Grove, which is where we're heading now. to 102 Edith Grove to be precise, where I think it's fair to say is where the Rolling Stones were formed. Literally metres away from where Joe's home was when he recorded what has been described as the best album of the 80s, Brian Jones, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger had been busy laying the foundations for the Rolling Stones 16 years earlier. Did I mention what a small world it is? We've only walked 5 minutes to get here, having turned right onto Edith Grove away from the Thames. To what 3 words are lungs, places, trains. Between the time that Brian Jones and Mick Jagger moved into the first floor flat here in April 1962, to the time that Brian, Mick and Keith, who joined them shortly afterwards, moved out in September 1963, they had settled on the classic Stones lineup that included Bill Wyman and Charlie Watts, named a band, got themselves a manager, a recording contract, their first single and a TV appearance on Thank You Lucky Stars. Now, I know I'll keep banging on about the significance of some of these locations. On this occasion, I'm going to leave it to Bill Wyman. He said, "It was here that ideas were born, riffs were tested, and the rebellious edge that would define our sound started to take shape." This was also the location of their first photo shoot. There's a famous photo of the 5 of them sat in the middle of the road. Due to copyright restrictions, I can't publish it, but you can find it easily on your favourite search engine. My wife did suggest I recreate the photo, but I said the lorries are going far too fast. Edith Grove takes us back to the King's Road, where we'll start to make our way back towards Sloane Square, our starting point. Just diverting off it now and again. We've turned right and very quickly, 3 minutes from where Brian, Mick and Keith lived, is number 500, on the corner. A betting shop now, but in the 60s it was a Weatherby Arms pub. It had a room in it where the Stones used for rehearsal, and it's here that Bill Wyman responded to an advert for a bass guitarist in December 1962. Charlie Watts joined in early 63, and I think it's reasonable to assume that it was here that the 5 of them first played together. Looking at the building today, for me sums up the King's Road, particularly the western end where we are now. If you're coming here hoping to get a feel of the 60s, you'll be disappointed. However, back then, this was the place to get the cutting edge of fashion. The properties were cheaper to rent than at the Sloane Square end, consequently attracting independents. One of the most celebrated was at number 488 on the next block opposite the World's End pub. Number 488 was home to Granny Takes a Trip. You may or may not have visited here back in the late 60s, but if you've ever seen photos from that era of John Lennon, Yoko Ono, George Harrison, Jimi Hendrix, Ray Davies, Mick Jagger, Twiggy, well, you get the picture. They were all customers of Granny Takes a Trip. It was a mix of vintage and new, floral and velvet, but nothing mass-produced. There's still a set of steps up to it. The shop front is very different now, but to be fair, they used to regularly totally revamp the exterior with eye-catching artwork. A little further along the road, on the same side, just where the road bends around a little, we find a genuine bona fide boutique whose roots are also back in the 60s. It had had various owners and names, reflecting the changing fashions of the times, and in 1971, Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren rented part of the shop. They were a couple who were going to have a big impact on fashion and music, and this shop, in its different guises, was to be at the heart of it. But back in 1971, they weren't so much looking to the future, more to the past. They called their shop Let It Rock. They had a jukebox, sold rock and roll vinyl and 50s clothing. Like most of London's trendiest boutiques, it had a bold frontage with Let It Rock in large pink letters. It's said that Screaming Lord Sutch stuck the letters up for Vivienne and Malcolm, as by day he was a window cleaner. In early 1974, therefore, they rebranded the shop and called it Sex. This proved to be the defining point in both their careers. Incidentally, this sign, also in bold pink letters, was put up with the assistance of Glenn Matlock, the future bass player at the Sex Pistols, who worked here part-time as a shop assistant, as did Chrissie Hynde of the Pretenders fame. The shop moved away from being a meeting point for teddy boys to being the place to be for punks. Bootlace ties and draped suits were out, and provocative t-shirts and safety pins were in. While Vivienne was focused on clothes and fashion, Malcolm had an interest in the music scene. He'd spent some time in the States working with the New York Dolls, and in 1974 he started to form the band that would become the Sex Pistols. The name was chosen partly as a promotional tool for the shop. He didn't have to look far for three of the original members. Glenn Matlock, as I've already mentioned, worked in the shop, while Steve Jones and Paul Cook were regular customers. The lead singer took a little bit longer. Malcolm wasn't looking for a talented vocalist, it's much more about the right image. However, John Lydon did audition by singing along to the jukebox in the shop. The rest, as I say, is history. Make no mistake, this small humble shop has been the scene of much that influenced music and particularly fashion in the second half of the 20th century. I call it a humble shop, but above the shop windows there's a damn big clock that has been a local landmark since 1980 when the shop front was last remodelled. I don't know who fitted the clock, but I'm guessing it wasn't the local window cleaner or a part-time shop assistant, because it's still on the wall 46 years later. It's a 13-hour clock and the hands go around anti-clockwise. I don't know the reason, and to be quite honest here, I can't be bothered finding out. After all, it is Vivienne Westwood and Malcolm McLaren, and I'm not sure there has to be any logic. The shop was renamed and rebranded again when the clock went up and called World's End, which is what it's still called today. I apologise for not showing more of the building, but although Vivienne is no longer with us, the business is still owned and run by a widower and selling her designs. I wanted to show some of her distinctive shoes in the window. Now, I've mentioned the World's End estate, the World's End pub, and now the World's End shop, so maybe a brief explanation is required. It's not unique to Chelsea. In fact, in London alone, there were a number of pubs that bore the name, but they also exist around the country. It would normally be the pub that would come first, and the area would embrace the name afterwards. There was a pub bearing this name on this site in the 1700s, and it would generally be the last pub or staging post as you leave an urban area. Nowadays, you'd probably have to go another 15 miles before you reach the edge of London. We'll move on now, but staying on the King's Road. Just a 4-minute walk away, we'll find ourselves outside the Bluebird as it's called now. As you can see from the sign, it used to be called the Bluebird Cafe, but the cafe was dropped from the name, maybe partly to save confusion and trademark issues with the famous Bluebird Cafe in Nashville. Due to the railings and shrubbery, you don't get a clear view of this classic Art Deco building, but if you venture inside, as I'm about to do, and I suggest you do the same, you may well recognise the frontage as a car showroom, which is what it was originally designed for. The showroom could hold 300 cars and it also had a large workshop space. It opened with great fanfare in 1923 as the Bluebird Garage at the height of the golden era of British motoring. It folded 4 years later. As you may guess by the name, the business to all intents and purposes was Malcolm Campbell's. Although he didn't invest any of his own money, the losses were borne by the shareholders. 2 years after the garage opened, Campbell broke the land speed record in a Sunbeam, which was called Bluebird, of course. The car is on display at the National Car Museum at Bewley, but it did make a guest appearance at the Bluebird on the 100th anniversary of its record-breaking run in 2025. The building has had many uses over the last century, including an ambulance station. It's now a restaurant, bar, stroke cafe, befitting its Grade 2 listed building and location in the heart of Chelsea. There are plenty of places that you can get an alcoholic drink between here and Sloane Square, but this place is a bit special. And if you're only down the King's Road once, why not push the boat out and treat yourself? It's worth taking a look upstairs while you're here. The main restaurant is up here and a very nice bar which is open to the public. The space gives you a bit of a feel of the size of the building. Over the years, the Bluebird has played host to many rich and famous, from the Princess of Wales, Catherine and her sister Pippa, who were regulars, to David Beckham, Kylie Minogue and Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits, and of course the cast of Made in Chelsea. We're going to leave for King's Road for a little while now, just venturing north of it for the only time on this particular walk. That's not to say there's not lots to see. There's plenty of famous residents and interesting architecture within walking distance. There's the original Troubadour Club that inspired the famous music venue in Los Angeles, or previous homes of Kylie Minogue, George Michael, John Lydon once he started picking up his paychecks from the Sex Pistols, or Quentin Crisp. Close by is a Muse garage where Aston Martin was founded, and the Boltons, which is one of the most exclusive streets in London, which was once home to Madonna. No, we're going to leave them, maybe for another day. I like to keep my walks as compact as possible, so I'm not wandering too far. We've turned first right and then left onto Mallord Street. Not Mallard as in the duck, but Mallord as in James Mallord William Turner. He never lived here. In fact, the street wasn't built until 1909, over 50 years after JMW had died. But it was named after him, and it's the only Mallord Street in the country. One of the next generation of British artists did move in though. Esteemed Welsh portrait artist Augustus John had number 28 built in the style of Rembrandt's Dutch home. Gracie Fields lived here at the height of her fame in 1935 before she moved to America in 1940. But we're stopping outside number 13. I will give you what 3 words. Sends, models, depend. This was the London home of author A. A. Milne for 20 years, until 1940, the same year as Gracie Fields moved to America, and also the year that London was on the receiving end of a German bombing campaign known as the Blitz, which was timely because Chelsea suffered significant damage in this period. Now, you may say 1940, that's before I was even born, but I justified a mention in a baby boomer walk by saying that any baby boomer would have been brought up on A. A. Milne's greatest fictional character, Winnie the Pooh. Christopher Robin was of course one of Winnie the Pooh's best friends, and in real life A. A. Milne's son. He was born in this house. You may have noticed that during my walks I often refer to people's London home. That's because so many of the people we have been looking at will have had at least one other property, either in the English countryside or maybe in hotter climes, as in the case of Ian Fleming, who owned Goldeneye in Jamaica. Alan Alexander Milne's country house was Cotchard Farm in East Sussex, which is worthy of a mention. It was actually where Milne did most of his writing and where the inspiration of 100 Acre Wood and Pooh Sticks came from. It was his happy place for over 30 years until his death in 1956. It was also the country house of someone who we mentioned earlier. Original member of the Rolling Stones, Brian Jones bought the farm in 1968. Sadly, he died there the following year at the age of 27, drowning in the swimming pool. There have been books and documentaries about the circumstances regarding Brian's death, and to this day there's still speculation about what happened. But the official cause of death was drowning while under the influence of alcohol and drugs. Nowadays you can rent Cotchard Farm for holiday accommodation. It has 6 bedrooms and will cost you roughly £1,200 per night. We're going to continue now, again not far, but before we do, the house to the right, number 15, was home to British actor Dennis Price in the late 1940s. And I think the architecture is also worth a quick word. The style, arts and crafts, is different to what we've seen elsewhere on our walk so far, and does feature a bit in the neighbouring streets. I quite like it. It gives the area a bit of a suburban feel. At the end of Mallord Street we can pick up any viewers of part 1 of this walk who decided to take the shortcut I suggested. We'll then turn left up Old Church Street and then right into Carlisle Square. But on our way we'll pass Mulberry Walk, which has had its fair share of famous residents in the past. At the far end, at number 1A, is the first Chelsea home of Bill Wyman. Laurence Olivier also lived down here, but to be fair he seems to have lived in many of the streets in the area at some time or the other. Dire Straits' Mark Knopfler lived down here as well, as did Gianluca Vialli, the Chelsea Football Club legend, who sadly died in 2023. So here we are outside 22 Carlisle Square. This imposing property was the home of Sir David Frost and his wife for 25 years. Now, I've referred to Sir David's knighthood here, but many people that have been previously mentioned would have also had royal honours. Sir Mick Jagger, for example. It's nothing personal on my part, it's more that many people don't use their titles. Sir David did. While we're talking about knighthoods, a couple of facts that may interest you. Bob Geldof is sometimes referred to as Sir Bob in the media, and he does have an honorary knighthood, but as he's not a British citizen, he's not entitled to call himself Sir. David Bowie was offered a knighthood in 2003, but refused it. Now back to Sir David. His career reached both sides of the Atlantic. American viewers of a certain age will almost certainly be familiar with his interviews with American heavyweights, and in the case of Muhammad Ali, literally. Plus 7 presidents, including famously Richard Nixon. In the late 60s, early 70s, he travelled back and forth on Concorde to present his shows. Number 22 stands at the head of Carlisle Square, which is one of London's garden squares. While garden squares aren't unique to London, they are very common here. There are about 600, with around 400 protected by the London Squares Preservation Act of 1931, which was introduced following an outcry when some squares were targeted by property developers, including one in Mornington Crescent, where a 5-storey tobacco factory was built. This particular garden is for use of residents, as are many of them. In the time that the Frosts lived here, they laid on a summer garden party in the square, which became a major event in London's social calendar, attended by invited guests, which included royalty, politicians and showbiz stars. They all walked through this gate. I feel a list coming on. Okay, are you ready? Queen Camilla, Prince Edward, Princess Beatrice, John Cleese, Hugh Grant, Jackie Stewart, Michael Caine, Victoria Wood, Chris Tarrant, David Cameron, Lulu, Cliff Richard, Rod Stewart, Billy Connolly, Andrew Lloyd Webber, Ronnie Corbett, Elton John, Margaret Thatcher, Ronnie Barker, Richard Branson, Bruce Forsyth. Yes, it goes on, but we can't stand here all day. We're going to carry on and turn right at the far side of the park and walk back towards the King's Road. There's a little alleyway at the end which we'll go through. We will turn left onto the King's Road, leaving Carlisle Square behind. You will have just walked past Felicity Kendall's home, but as she still lives there, I'm not going to point it out. After a few minutes, we will come to Chelsea Old Town Hall on the opposite side of the road, which houses the Kensington and Chelsea Register Office. It's a very popular and busy venue for weddings. Over the years, there have been many famous people married here, although nowhere near as many as you may see credited elsewhere, because the Register Office has only been in the Old Town Hall since 1978. Before that, it was across the road at 250 Kings Road. So while people like Pierce Brosnan, Hugh Grant and Bobby Moore did indeed get married in the current venue, I want to concentrate on the old one. The what 3 words are held voice sheets. Nowadays, the building houses private offices, and so not open to the public, but the hall and staircase leading up to the first floor, where the Register Office was, still looks the same. I want to take a look at the stories of some of the couples who have walked down that staircase on their special day. Neil Aspinall married his bride, Susie Ornstein, on the 30th of August 1968. The name Neil Aspinall may mean nothing to you, but Neil was right at the heart of the Beatles story. He was a good friend of John, Paul, George and original drummer Pete Best before they were famous. He was employed by the Beatles in 1961 as a driver stroke personal assistant, and by the time he resigned due to ill health in 2007, he was managing Apple Corps, the Beatles' business. Ringo and Paul both attended the ceremony. Ringo had left the Beatles at the time after an argument with Paul. So for them both to attend says a lot about their strong relationship with Neil. The band were literally in the process of recording the White Album. John Lennon recorded the vocals of Dear Prudence on the day. It was also the day that Hey Jude was released as a single. The tragic tale revolves around a famous couple who married here in the January of the same year. Actress Sharon Tate and film director Roman Polanski. Sharon was brutally murdered 18 months later when she was 8.5 months pregnant, a victim of the infamous Charles Manson cult in her home in Los Angeles. Polanski currently lives in Europe. He was convicted of having sex with a 13-year-old girl in 1978 and fled the United States before he could be sentenced. Judy Garland described it as the happiest day in her life when she married her 5th husband here in March 1969, attracting a large crowd and media attention. She was found dead less than a mile away 3 months later in a rented Mews property following an accidental overdose. A much quieter affair was when Mark Bolan of T-Rex fame married here in 1970 with just 5 friends. It was months before he told his parents. His wife June divorced him on the grounds of adultery in 1973, and sadly Mark died in a car crash in 1977. Now, if you're planning on getting married at the Kensington and Chelsea Register Office in the future, and these stories aren't really inspiring you, then maybe the knowledge that Neil and Susie Aspinall were married for over 40 years until his death. We'll cross the road now and carry on until we get to Flood Street. It's the second road along. We're outside number 19. You can't see a great deal of it, it's behind a high fence now. This was the home of Dennis and Margaret Thatcher until she was elected as Prime Minister in 1979. By then it had been the family home for 12 years, in which time she had risen up through the ranks of the Conservative Party. The family will have known this part of Chelsea well. They'd lived on the 6th floor of the apartment block on the other side of the road from 1951 to 57. Their twins, Mark and Carol, were born in 1953. Agatha Christie also lived in this apartment block for 28 years until her death in 1976. It was a London base, and it's believed it's where she wrote The Mousetrap. If we look back up Flood Street a little, towards the King's Road, you'll see a pretty nondescript building with double doors. I'm going to ask you to use your imagination for a couple of minutes. It's late afternoon on March the 30th, 1967. Mark and Carol Thatcher are playing out on their bikes outside their new home. Their mum is cooking their tea, beans on toast. Dennis is caught up in the rush hour traffic on his way home from his job as an oil executive. Agatha Christie is putting the finishing touches to a latest Poirot novel. Then 4 limousines pull up outside 8 Flood Street, Chelsea Manor Studios, and 4 lads from Liverpool step out and walk into the building, dressed in brightly coloured faux military uniforms. They are about to take part in a photo shoot, the result of which was to become instantly recognisable to this day as one of the most famous album covers ever produced, which of course is Sgt. Pepper. Now, obviously, it didn't really quite happen like that. For a start, the Beatles only changed into their outfits once in the studio. Swan Court, where Agatha Christie lived, is a big block with over 100 apartments, and I don't know if number 48 faces onto Flood Street. I don't even know whether the Thatchers were living here at the time. They did move in 1967. And I can't be sure that Carol and Mark had beans on toast. But I hope it gives you a feel of the significance of this spot in the side street off the King's Road. 20th century British literature, politics and music were all part of its history in the 1960s. What I do know about the day is after the iconic photo shoot, the Beatles went to Abbey Road Studios and spent the night putting the finishing touches to With a Little Help from My Friends. We're going to cross back across the King's Road. There is a pedestrian crossing. Our next stop is Burnsall Street, which is within sight when you're back on the King's Road, but I will give you a 3 words. Hands, curve, wishes. There's a blue plaque on the wall which will tell you that Diana Dawes lived here. Diana features on the Sgt. Pepper cover, as does Oscar Wilde. She's very prominent on the front row. You really can't miss her. I've been spoilt for choice for locations to look at on this walk. I've picked this one not particularly because of her modelling or acting career, but more for what went on behind the front door here. For me, her private life was far more interesting than her public life. She was never too far away from controversy, and much of that was during the 15 years she lived here. She moved in 1953, the same year she was convicted of stealing alcohol from a friend's house, despite the fact that she earned good money from her films that year and also bought this house. Her choice in partners, I think, we can describe as questionable. Her first husband, Dennis Hamilton Gittins, who she married in 1951, was a good friend of infamous London gangsters Ronnie and Reggie Kray. They separated after 7 years, following rumours of affairs. Diana has since claimed that she had a 5-month affair with Elvis. Once they separated, she discovered her bank account was nowhere near as full as she expected. Dennis died the following year at the age of 32. Within 3 months of hearing of his death, she married Richard Dawson. To be honest, he seems a good sort. They had 2 sons, and after their divorce in 1967, the dad got custody. In 1968, Diana was declared bankrupt, owing Inland Revenue £48,000, and subsequently she sold 10 Burnsall Street. She married actor Alan Lake the same year. He was jailed for 18 months in 1970 for a knife attack on a landlord of a pub in Sunningdale, which is where the couple now lived. It's alleged that Diana Dawes disposed of the knife. After her death, it was claimed that she had £2 million tucked away in secret bank accounts, but despite efforts by her sons to trace it, it was never found. So, anyway, back to what went on behind this particular front door. I'm going to use a word here that you'll rarely hear me use, but it's the only word I can think of to describe it, and that's debauchery. Her parties were notorious, with poor movies, two-way mirrors on the ceiling and secret filming. Diana would claim that regular guests included film stars, socialites, sportsmen and TV personalities, without naming any names. Bob Monkhouse is one person who has said he attended some. Bob and Diana had an affair until he was scared off with a cutthroat razor by her then husband Dennis. Other people who were known to be regular visitors to the house, and I must stress at this point for obvious reasons, there's nothing to say they attended any parties, were the Cray twins and actor Oliver Reed. When we return to the King's Road, we'll stay on the same side. We're heading back towards where we started our walk. We're entering the main shopping stretch now, with lots of national and international brands, but I just want to point out number 107 as we pass. At the time of filming, it was a fitness centre called Rebel, but back in the 1960s, it was a private members club. Where if you happen to be a member, you may have seen any of the Beatles, Jagger, Brian Jones, the Supremes, David Bowie, Michael Caine, Peter O'Toole, Peter Sellers, Warren Beatty, Sammy Davis Jr. or Twiggy. I'm not sure if I've mentioned Twiggy yet, but she is right at the heart of the pop cultural revolution that radiated from the King's Road in the 1960s. There's a famous photo of her taken on this stretch where she's doing a star jump in the middle of the road. Due to copyright restrictions, I can't publish it, but you can find it easily on your favourite search engine. I did suggest to my wife that she recreate the photo, but she said the buses are going far too fast. We're now looking at 138A King's Road. The what three words are cost, tidy, aware. I don't think it's too much of an exaggeration to say that this premises is where the King's Road's reputation as being the beating heart of fashion and music culture began, and I don't mean Joe and the Juice. In the early post-war years, Chelsea was still primarily seen as an area where artists lived and had their studios. The shops that were there were largely just catering for local residents. But that bohemian feel did attract creative types. Amongst them was Mary Quant and her husband Alexander, and crucially a man named Archie McNair, a local businessman who owned a photography shop. The three of them bought 138A and in 1955 opened a Bazaar Boutique. Within 10 years, Mary Quant was a world-famous fashion designer whose name is synonymous with the miniskirt and hot pants. The boutique was such a success that it drew other young fashion designers to the King's Road, and by the mid-60s, for a spell, London was the centre of the fashion world. Downstairs in the basement, the trio opened a coffee bar stroke jazz club called Alexander's, where the discreet and private environment made it a popular destination for famous personalities of the time. Princess Margaret, Audrey Hepburn and Brigitte Bardot are all said to have been customers. I was going to pop into Joe and the Juice because I've heard that it's famous for having music in the background, much as Bazaar did in the 60s, and I thought I may catch a bit of Kinks or maybe The Who, and introduce myself to Joe while I'm there. But when I read on their website that they pride themselves on their electronic vibe with deep beats, and that Joe never existed, I decided to give it a miss. If you turn around now and look across the road, you can see a blue plaque on number 50 Smith Street. If your eyesight's very good, you may be able to see that this was the home of P.L. Travers. You can check it out from afar or cross the King's Road again. Either way, we're on the last stretch now, only 10 minutes walk back to Sloane Square. I'm not sure how to refer to her. She was christened Helen Lyndon Gough, adopted the name Pamela Lyndon Travers and the pen name P.L. Travers. Knowing the little I do about her, I can't imagine her as a Pam. She never married, so maybe it's Miss Travers, but possibly Ms. I'm going to stick with P.L. Travers. She lived much of her life in Chelsea, her last 34 years in nearby Shawfield Street, but the 16 years she lived in this house I feel are particularly interesting. P.L. Travers, of course, was the author of Mary Poppins. The film Saving Mr. Banks was partly set while she lived here, her meetings with Walt Disney in London and a visit to Disney Studios coincide with this period. Incidentally, while we're talking about films, there's a film called Goodbye Christopher Robin, which is set during a period that A.A. Milne lived in Mallord Street. You may find it interesting. Walt Disney seemed to have an affinity with West London because he also acquired the rights to Winnie the Pooh and J.M. Barrie's Peter Pan. J.M. Barrie only lived a couple of miles away. Sadly, life doesn't always have happy endings like Walt's films. Christopher Robin grew up to resent his fame. He was picked on at school. His relationship with his dad was strained, and only saw his mum once in the last 15 years of her life. He inherited his dad's fortune, but was reluctant to use it. However, his daughter Claire was born with cerebral palsy, and so he used some of the royalties to support her. The rest he used to fund a charity in her name. In the case of P.L. Travers, whilst the film depicted her as a feisty character, which I think is probably fair to say, what it didn't mention was the story of her adopted son. This is a much darker story. As she approached the age of 40, she decided to adopt a son. A couple in Dublin who were struggling to bring up their 7 grandchildren agreed for Travers to adopt twin boys who were 6 months old. But when it came to it, despite the grandparents' appeals not to separate them, she said she could only afford to take one. She consulted an astrologer to decide which one to take. Camillus, I think that's how you pronounce it, was brought up in privileged circumstances, and the whole of his childhood he believed that P.L. Travers was his birth mother and he was an only child, until one day in 1956 his twin brother Anthony turned up on the doorstep of 50 Smith Street. Anthony's upbringing had been polar opposite. He'd grown up in poverty. The boys were very different and had little in common, understandably so. Camillus never forgave his adopted mother. The boys went their separate ways, but both became alcoholics. Anthony died at the age of 65, living in a squalid flat where he'd moan about his brother's good fortune. Camillus paid for and attended his funeral. He died 6 years later. The story of Peter Pan doesn't have a happy ending either, and in some ways has similarities to Christopher Robin. If you've seen my Hampstead walk, you'll remember the graves of the Llewellyn Davies family. The boys were the inspiration for the Peter Pan character, and all died young. Peter at the age of 65, when he threw himself under a train at Sloane Square station. There's no suggestion that his suicide was directly connected to his association with Peter Pan. He had his health problems, but like Christopher Robin, he had grown to resent being publicly known as the inspiration for a famous literary children's character. He felt exploited by Barry. Unlike Christopher Robin, however, he did hope to benefit from the author's inheritance, which he did to a point, but Barry had signed over the royalties from Peter Pan to the Great Orme Street Hospital, and the majority of his estate went to his secretary. OK, I'm leaving you now to make your way back to Sloane Square. If you're looking for somewhere for a coffee and a slice of cake on your way back, the Peter Jones department store might be worth a visit. It has an impressive light and airy atrium where you can take the escalators up to the cafe on the top floor with views over West London. I hope you've enjoyed this walk around this special part of West London and you've learnt a little bit along the way. I'd be grateful if you can help spread the word. If you can send a link to my channel or video to a friend, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Thank you very much.